Good evening. Good evening to all those of you in person, as well as the more than 300 people who are joining us online. So let me say welcome to all those physically and virtually who are here. Thank you. My name's Jack Klieger. I'm the president and CEO of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, Living Memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's discussion between Richard Hurowitz, the author of In the Garden of the Righteous, and Margaret Hoover, host of Firing Line with Margaret Hoover on PBS. Margaret's a descendant of Herbert Hoover, 31st President of the United States, of whom a book was written in 2012 called Herbert Hoover and the Jews, detailing President Hoover's connection and aid to Jewish communities. We will have a future program about that. And we're fortunate to have Margaret with us tonight. Full disclosure, I'm a good friend of Margaret's husband, John Avlon of CNN, who is a great journalist and author in his own right, and also has very valiantly tried to help me deplete my wine cellar over the years. Here at the museum, we're dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life before, during, and since the Holocaust. As part of our mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate, anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice. Tonight is the first event in the museum's series of programs related to the upcoming exhibition about rescuers, Courage to Act. The museum's first exhibition for children 9 and up, which for us is a very big step. Tells the incredible story of the Danish rescue of over 95% of its Jewish population in October of 1943. In the Garden of the Righteous tells the story of those non-Jews who, despite enormous risk, went to great lengths to resist Nazism and work to help others survive. I would like to encourage you all to come back to the museum to see Courage to Act when it opens on October 15th as we celebrate the 80th anniversary of this amazing story. I'd also like to encourage all of you who feel impacted by tonight's program, the work we do and the exhibitions we share with our communities, to please consider making a donation. We are still actively fundraising for Courage to Act, and your donation tonight could help us achieve our fundraising goals and continue for us to do the work we do in programs such as this one. I'd also like to ask you all who are here in person to silence your cell phones now. Also a reminder that In the Garden of the Righteous is for sale in the lobby, and that Richard will be signing books after the end of the program. Thank you so much for joining us, both in person and via live stream this evening. It's now my pleasure to introduce Richard Hurowitz and Margaret Hoover.
Hello, welcome. Welcome, Richard.
Hi.
I am so excited to have this conversation with you because this book is a true contribution.
Oh, thank you.
And I've delighted in learning about the characters in this story who are real people. In the Garden of the Righteous, every book has an origin story. This book's origin story is a story within a story, The White Rose, which you learned about around the time you began to think about, you began to conceive the kernel of what became this book. What was The White Rose, and what is the book's origin story?
Yeah, so origins, it's got a whole, it's like a universe, like the Marvel universe. And thank everybody who's here for braving the UN traffic, and I know I understand we have a very large audience online, so thank everyone for tuning in. Yeah, so the book, the origin went back to when I was in college, actually with Margaret's husband, we were classmates, and that was right around the time when the Holocaust Museum opened on the Mall, so don't look up the date because then you'll know how old I am. But my family actually doesn't have we were all in the United States during this time. My wife's mother and her family fled Germany in 1938, but we were not. Don't have Holocaust survivors in my direct family, but because a lot of people went down, and particularly American Jews. So we went down and went through the exhibit, and I'm sure you've all been there, but I remember it's very difficult. Right, and it's actually, if you've been to Yad Vashem, it's a different experience. The U.S. Holocaust Museum is, I think, intentionally really tough, and they've got the boxcars. And actually, as I've talked with people about the book all over, a lot of people, whether they're Jewish or not, everyone seems to remember this pile of shoes that was there. And you look closely, and you see a lot of them are children's-sized shoes, because 1.5 million children died out of the 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust. And so, it was really overwhelming for me at the time. And then I came out into this very small room that they had that was devoted to people who had tried to do something. And there was a small exhibit with some students, and actually one of the people on the cover of the book is the photo I remember seeing, which was this young guy who was a little bit around my age at the time, and he had a pipe. And then I kind of read their story, and it was a story of this group called the White Rose. And they were German, mostly medical students. The founder of the group was a guy named Hans Scholl, and his younger sister, Sophie, was in college with him. And they're very well known, maybe some of you know who they are in Germany, but they're very not well known outside of Germany. And they basically tried to foment an uprising against Hitler, and they were very idealistic. So they thought everyone was gonna agree with them, and they had a mentor who was, someone who was very committed to liberal democracy, which is an issue a lot of us are focused on now. And they started circulating leaflets in all over colleges and universities that went all over Germany, and they even went into Vienna. And then they started mailing them to people's post office boxes. And then in the middle of this, there were 4 boys that got shipped off to the front. They came back even more upset. They saw terrible things. There was an amazing scene, actually, where Hans Scholl he was on a troop transport, and he saw this young girl on the side of the road, Jewish, they were at hard labor. And he jumped off the train and gave her a daisy and a piece of chocolate. And they came back, and the guy with the pipe, Alexander Schmorl, is actually the second leaflet of the White Rose is one of the first documents that publicized the Holocaust. And he said, this is a shame on Germany, and 300,000 Jews at that time had already been murdered. And so in any event, they did get some students, interested, but it was not really. And then one day they were bringing the leaflets to the University of Munich. They would leave them between classes, and they went to the top of a stairway, and Sophie Scholl had a bunch in her pocketbook, and she threw them down this atrium, and the maintenance man locked the door. He was an ardent Nazi. He called the Gestapo. They arrived within minutes, arrested the 2 of them. They hauled one of the other guys in with them, and they were put on trial immediately. Hitler personally sent his favorite judge down, and they were executed within days. And then the other 3 prime movers, including Schmorl, were captured a few weeks later. And this was a case actually that was, Thomas Mann talked about it on the U.S., he was in exile on the U.S. radio. People knew about it. And the thing that, so one of the things that actually was, it stuck with me is, the idealism of these kids. And Sophie Scholl said at her trial, she said, the thing is that everyone agrees with us, but everyone is afraid to say it. And of course that wasn't true at all. And then, after the war now, there are more schools in Germany named after Sophie and Hans Scholl than I think anybody else, because that's what they want you. The Germans have actually done a pretty good job, in recent years with this, but obviously that's how they, that's what they want to think of when they think of the war. And, Hitler had a secretary who wrote her memoirs, and she said in it that she came across something about Sophie Scholl, and she looked at the dates that she had lived, and she realized she had been born at the same time. And she said, you know, it doesn't matter how young I was, I really had no excuse for not doing anything. So this story really affected me, and I thought about doing my thesis on it at Yale, and then I realized I didn't know German, and so I did it on Alexander the Great, and then, but I became interested in rescue after that, and then on the 75th anniversary of their execution, I wrote an article in the New York Times about the White Rose, and it went like completely viral. Trended to like one of the top stories of the day. It was shared tens of thousands of times. And then one of the things I noticed actually, because when you write something like that, I'm sure you've had this experience, Margaret, you like crawl all over Twitter and like the comments to see what people say, and I did not find one anti-Semitic Nazi comment anywhere online. It was very inspirational. At the time, it was during the Parkland shootings, and a lot of people were drawing a parallel with those kids that became active. And so it felt like these stories really touched a chord. And so I started writing up a number of other stories for the Wall Street Journal and the Times and the LA Times. I wrote about the King of Morocco. That went to #2 on Reddit. I wrote several pieces for the Daily Beast, where the editor was very talented at the time. And so I kept getting this amazing reaction to them that was so positive, and I feel like people in the world wanted to hear these stories, and of course they're very undertold. Once you get beyond, Raoul Wallenberg and Oskar Schindler, even the story of Denmark, which is they're going to have this amazing exhibit for children. That maybe some people know that, and you get past that, that's it.
Can I stop you there?
Yeah.
Why are the stories of those who saved the Jews in the Holocaust undertold?
Yeah, there's
undercovered.
There's a few reasons, and then
we'll get back to your origins.
No. I'm almost done because I decided to turn it into a book because of that. So that's.
But I have a follow-on.
Yes,
but why are they so undercover?
So there's a few reasons. First of all, so there's the historiographical kind of reason, which is that after the war there were a few things. One is, this is the one part that I'm a little bit sympathetic to, is that a lot of the first generation of survivors had been in camps, and nobody had rescued them.
Yeah.
And there was this desire and concern that we not distort the record, because
or to focus where the focus ought to be on.
For example, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem has honored 27,000 people, right? That seems like a lot.
27,000 people who participated in rescue of Jews during the
who have
Holocaust.
gotten the title of righteous among the nations, which is a very high honor, and there's very stringent criteria. I think if we expand the criterion, if somebody, because I think,
that 27,000 is, but a fraction.
Right, so that's out of 500 million. So if you fill Madison Square Garden with a representative sample of Europeans at the time, you'd have one person out of. Okay, so that puts it in
So that's
perspective.
one reason.
So they didn't want to distort the record.
Yeah,
then you had I think the part of all of us that is much more interested in the darkness. So there was a lot of work done on the perpetrators and also why people went along, and you had the Milgram experiments and the Stanford prison experiments, and that's what people were interested in.
So maybe it just wasn't appropriate at the time.
Well,
do you think
but the other thing that happened, which we can, which is almost spookily consistent throughout, is that the rescuers themselves, most of them did not come forward. So there were a lot of reasons for that, but
their rescue stories remained a secret.
Yeah, and then in sort of the late '60s, some of the younger survivors or people who had been saved started coming forward. But then you also had, there was a lot of the Holocaust, took place in Eastern Europe, and behind the Iron Curtain, you had people, there was institutional anti-Semitism. There was also a suspicion that if you helped the Jews, you were sympathetic to the Allies. Mm-hmm. And so there were people who were honored at Yad Vashem, including a woman I write about, Irena Sendler, who wasn't allowed to go to Israel to get her medal and was basically persecuted for what she did. Her children couldn't go to university because of the communists. So that was a whole set of stories that didn't come out until the Berlin Wall fell. But universally, when you look at these stories, the people afterwards would say, to the extent they told anybody, they say, I didn't do anything special. I didn't, I just did what any decent person would do, which is amazing, because I've seen hundreds of interviews with these people and they use almost the identical language. So there's something about their personality that made them very reticent to want to talk about it. I also think like rescue is traumatic. So I think a lot of them had, post-traumatic stress.
So I just want to frame this for the audience. So the book, basically what you did, Richard, is you picked 10 stories of characters or individuals who collaborated or worked on their own to save the Jews, and stories that had not really been told and were sort of unknown until this point. You write in the introduction, there are literally hundreds of thousands of people alive today because of the rescuers you will meet in this book. Their acts of righteousness truly echo down through the ages. There's, against the backdrop of the darkness of the Holocaust, you pose the question, where was God in the Holocaust? And for you, you say that part of the answer is in the story of Pharaoh's daughter. Which is excerpted, that those lines from Exodus sort of mark the very start, the very first quote in the book. So why is that? Explain that.
So there's a lot of writing in the Talmud about the Pharaoh's daughter, who's considered the first righteous. And one of the reasons I mentioned in the introduction is I do feel that because these stories are undertold, that Jewish people in particular, but I think that a whole world really owes these people a debt of gratitude. And part of the way we can do that is by telling their stories. And so that is embedded in the way people thought about the Pharaoh's daughter. But she was considered the first righteous among the nations, right? Her father had decreed that all Jewish children at that time, well, not the firstborn, all Jewish male children be killed. And Moses was put on and she lifted him. And she did this, by the way, when you look into some of the commentary, they point out, because the passage you're talking about, which is
I'm going to read the passage.
Go ahead.
The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile. While her maidens walked along the Nile, she spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy crying. She took pity on it and said, "That must be a Hebrew child."
Right. So the one of the biggest. So it depends where you were in Europe, but if you were caught, and the further east you went, the worse it was. You would get in prison or killed. And if you were in Poland, they would kill you and your family and the family you tried to rescue. And the biggest risk that any rescuer took, which happened all over Europe, was denunciation. So, again, I think some of these people were so traumatized they didn't want to tell anybody what they did even after the war. But so the Pharaoh's daughter, her father had made this edict, and she did this in front of all of her maidens, and so she did this publicly. And then she proceeded to do it publicly and raised Moses in the palace for his childhood, and so that was very risky because she had defied an edict from the Pharaoh, and they had different rules then about your children. Like they weren't as she could have been executed for that despite being a princess, and. There's a lot of writing on this. In another part of the Bible, in Chronicles, actually give her name as Bitya. And there's a tradition in Judaism that she is one of, I think, 9 people that was allowed to go directly to paradise in her lifetime. And the other thing that is kind of really, I think, quite beautiful is that the name Moses, my son is actually studying Egyptology, so I know a little bit about this to be dangerous. Moses is obviously an Egyptian word. Like Tutmosis II or whatever, and so that was the name she gave him, and he has actually had a number of different names, including the name his parents would have given him, and God calls him by the name that the Pharaoh's daughter gave. So the tradition is that God respected her so much for what she did that that God called Moses by the name that was given to him by the Pharaoh's daughter, which wasn't his original given name, as sort of an honor to her. And when you think about the Holocaust, and it's interesting because I thought, Margaret, I would have gotten more questions about this because there's this question of where was God in the Holocaust, right? And Elie Wiesel said one thing in Night and then actually talked later about regretting it, right? But I feel it's not my place because, to say that's a very complicated issue. But to me, what I think that passage talks about is the fact that, if you believe that we're created with free will and like really believe that that's the case, you have a choice, and things can go into the direction of where they went with the Nazis and with the vast majority of Europe going along with it, or they can go to these amazing but super rare people who did something totally different, and they made the choice. And that, to me, is like reflective of the divine spark, or where we would want the world to go, is that we would all be like that.
You say directly, you say God was in the actions of the righteous.
Yeah. And
so,
I
so
mean, I think...
you chose to write about the stories of the righteous.
Yeah, and I actually, I once wrote a story about a collaborator, actually an American Nazi named Philip Johnson, who's also known for being a famous architect. But it was literally an American Nazi. He was, when they put out a list in, I think it was Harper's Magazine, of the top 15 American fascists, there he was.
Right up there.
And it's a whole long conversation, but I wrote it, and I wrote it when they closed the Four Seasons restaurant, because I just thought it was, it completely successfully whitewashed his reputation. And a number of people have said to me, "Are you going to write a sequel?" And some people have said, "Are you going to write a book about the collaborators?" And a friend of mine who had been very inspirational in this book, I was having lunch with him, and I said that, and he put his hand. It's actually Abe Foxman, who used to run the ADL, on me, and he said, "Don't go there." And he's a survivor. He's like, "That's not.
It's not necessary.
Let's focus on this."
So, you write that in the founding of Yad Vashem in 1953, one of the core missions was to recognize those who risked their lives to save the Jews. However, of the 10 stories you chronicle, they are not all honored, because Yad Vashem has very, very high criteria. So I want to just get into some of the stories of the individuals that you tell, because, so let's start with a couple of them, maybe who are honored by Yad Vashem or not. But the story of the circus is one that's just so fantastical and amazing, and it should be a movie.
I agree.
This is Adolf Althoff, who is this sort of fabulous man who runs the circus and who decides to hide Jews in the circus in plain sight.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. So they this was in Germany, and I talk a little. People have asked me what made people do this, and one of the things I think there's an unusual number of people who are in either creative professions or international professions that tended to rescue. And this, you can't get more international than the circus, right? Anybody who's been to the circus, and it's a family business, right? So you've got the Italian family that since the Renaissance has been juggling, and this family and that family, and very multinational, very, tolerant. People run off and join the circus at the time because they wanted to get away from society. And people don't know this, but that for 100 years ago, there were a lot of Jewish circus families in Europe, and so they all knew each other, the non-Jews and a lot of them married into each other, and they were all friends, and they all traveled the world together because they were often itinerant circuses. I learned a lot about the circus, and actually I learned Americans, we invented the having animals in the circus, and. So Althoff he was considered circus royalty. His family traced, the circus as we know it, it was not the Roman circus, but actually was invented around the Renaissance with traveling fairs. And so his family go all the way back there. So he was born into a circus family, and he had a lot of siblings, and they each had their own circus. And then there were a few Jewish families, and one of them was the Lorch family circus. And they were known for an act that you've probably all seen if you've seen the circus, where one guy will lie on his back and will kind of pedal like a bicycle somebody else who does flips. And that's called an Icarin routine. And they were the best in the world at that. And they actually were in residence in New York at the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, and I have the poster in the book. They were the highest paid circus act in the world, and this was at a time when the circus was huge. It was huge. I mean, in Paris, the highest paid entertainer in Europe was the clown at the Parisian circus. Picasso, they all used to go. The circus was it, and And the Jews were a big part of it, and they also had families, and then when the 30s happened, the Nazis went after the Jewish circuses, and they actually, interestingly enough, they took the circus really seriously. Like Goebbels really took the circus seriously, unlike, the art. They had degenerate art, so all of the modern artists, whether they were Jewish or not, were persecuted, and the modern writing, you had the book burnings where they're throwing Hemingway on the fire, and Thomas Mann. The circus was something they valued as a German Aryan art form, so they wanted all the Jews out of it. So they started by making it you couldn't employ a Jew, and then they started, the Jewish circuses went bankrupt, and so the circus owners who were in the Nazi party, they could buy the circus for nothing, and they basically drove all the Jews out of the circus. And then the Lorch family, which had been very wealthy, was, many of them were deported eventually to Auschwitz. And there was an 18-year-old girl named Irena Danner, so she was a part of the Lorch family, and her family were all performers, and she was an acrobat, and she, when they were, being persecuted and potentially in danger, she one night showed up at the Althoff circus because they kind of knew them distantly, and they'd had one of their relatives was married, but he was this, they were known for being nice people, and she knocked on the door and told him the story, and he said, "Why don't you come perform in the circus?" Under an assumed name, right? So he put her in the circus, and then she came and said, "Can you hide my mother and my younger sister?" So they joined the circus, and then her father, who was not Jewish but was sent home from the Russian front to divorce the mother because she was Jewish. He went into hiding rather than do that, so he was on the run, and then she fell in love with a clown who was also 18 years old. They weren't allowed to formally get married, but they basically got married, and they had 2 children, and she almost died in childbirth because a Nazi doctor refused to treat her. Yeah. And then the Althoffs took care of her, and actually they found her, the second child, a doctor 100 miles away who would treat her. So then they're going all around and they're performing in the circus, and this circus was really
performing for Nazis.
So the Gestapo, anywhere where this circus stopped, they would inspect it. And Althoff was amazing that he talked about it later. He would tell these stories about being in Russia dancing with bears, and he had this crazy, he had
He would distract them with
yes,
his
and
stories.
he'd give them brandy. And there were literally moments where, the Gestapo would show up and they would send them in to hide behind the elephants or to go in the trailer. And he was kind of doing, and they loved his circus because it was very neat and orderly, okay? So the Gestapo was very impressed with him. And for several years, he traveled all around. They used to give the tickets to the Gestapo, and all this time, these Nazis
performers
are watching a Jewish young girl acrobat, and and it was amazing. And then and they survived. They all survived.
They were never found out.
Never found out. They all survived.
There was one rumor at one time.
Yes. So this goes to the denunciation, and one guy in the circus came over, and he said to Althoff, "I think you're hiding. Are there Jews in the circus?" And Althoff said he figured out a way to basically told him, you work for me, and then he figured out an excuse to fire the guy quietly, and that was the closest they got, but the guy was threatening to denounce them. And he would have been, they all would have been killed. Yeah. So they survived, they stayed in touch after the war, and Althoff, it's funny, he actually, again, they didn't really tell anybody, they went back into the circus, their family, they continued in the circus. If you remember Gunter Gable Williams, the lion tamer, used to be in the 80s here. He was trained by Adolf Althoff.
So how did this story come out?
So because it's interesting, when he was famous enough that when he died, there was a obituary, doesn't mention it. It came out years later, and somebody did a magazine article. It came out because Irena, the girl that he saved, got him honored at Yad Vashem. And his wife. We were talking about him, but actually they both rescued. There was a team, she was as involved as he was, and she also was in the circus. There's a picture of her riding an elephant
Yeah.
in the book.
Yeah,
So when they were honored, the story came out, and then there's not a lot on it. I mean, there was a German, like, the equivalent of like the New York Times Sunday magazine did an article, but when you get honored at Yad Vashem, you have to have eyewitness testimony. So that was like really an amazing resource for my book because, you have, she gave testimony, her husband, who was the clown, gave testimony, and we ended up looking at, I say we because I had help in a lot of languages. I think this book we did research in like 12 different languages.
I want to do 2 more stories at least. Sousa Mendes and Hiram Bingham. I mean, Sousa Mendes is an amazing story about a Portuguese national who did this courageous thing, but suffered. Terribly for it.
Yeah.
Set it up for us.
Yeah. I mean, both of these guys So Sousa Mendes, they were both diplomats, and there's an unusual number of people who rescued Jews successfully who were diplomats, but that's because they were in a position to help. But when you actually look at the percentage of diplomats who helped, it was actually quite small, very small. Because a lot of times people went in the Foreign Service, they like to follow orders, and to do this, you were often defying your government. So Sousa Mendes, when people ask me, like, who's your favorite, okay, which I often get, and it's like asking who's your favorite child, but like, he's one of my candidates. And he was an aristocratic Portuguese twin. He was a twin, and he was from a family that really traced its lineage back. He believed he was actually descended from conversos, because I think something on the order of 1/3 of the population of Portugal today is of some Jewish descent. And his name, Sousa Mendes, and where he's from in Portugal would be consistent with that. So anyway, he was a twin, and he and his brother both went into the Foreign Service when it was still a monarchy. His brother was like the really effective diplomat. He eventually became foreign minister. And Sousa Mendes was the kind of diplomat who was also very talented, but he was like the entertaining, like bon vivant. And he went all over the world. He had this huge life. He had amazing people in his house. Einstein came and taught his kids math, and like he had Nobel Prize winning, playwrights, and he was just like this amazing guy. And he and his wife had 14 children all over the world. And at their house in Portugal, they would fly a flag for each place where their children were born. He had 2 sons who were American, because he was posted at one point to Berkeley, California. Those boys actually fought in World War II for America. Wow. And so but he was, sort of, he wasn't, like the rising star, like his brother, but he was a really good diplomat, and everywhere he went, people loved him, like really loved him and his family. And then in 1940, in June, he found himself in Bordeaux. He was the consul general, which, one of the main jobs of the consul general is to issue visas. And not to give a lesson in Portuguese history, but at the time, the dictator of Portugal was a very complicated, very Machiavellian guy named Salazar, who actually happened to have grown up with the Sousa Mendes twins, but was from a poorer family and kind of resented them. And he was a very complicated character because he was against party, like any kind of like one-party state. He wasn't really a fascist, but he was closer to the fascists. He hated the communists. He was really a technocrat, but also had an iron fist, and was kind of a mean guy. And again, very Machiavellian, and his main foreign policy goal was to make sure that Portugal didn't get pulled into the war. And he did that because if you look at the map, right, if Portugal's going to get pulled in, it's because Spain gets pulled in. So he was very friendly with Franco, and he was kind of Franco's de facto advisor. And Franco, they'd had the Spanish Civil War. They didn't want any refugees coming in, even though they were neutral, because he was, allied with basically quietly with Hitler. Not so quietly. I mean, they put him on the Nazis and the Italians put him in power. So there was a circular that Salazar sent out to every embassy called Circular 14 that said, you cannot give visas to any refugees. There were a few categories. It was like Americans, British, French, I think Belgians if they were famous. And then they listed people that could not come in, of which there were people without passports, which was most Jews, and then specifically kind of Jews. And this went out to everybody, and Sousa Mendes had a number of people start showing up at the embassy.
Well, this is because he's in France at the
he's
time
in France,
that France falls.
And even before it fell, people were fleeing to France because they thought France was a safe haven. So people start showing up, and he gave a couple of visas against the orders, including one to a guy who wasn't Jewish, but he was a professor that was on the run. And he'd been sort of they said, stop doing this. And then 1940 happens, June 1940, and fall of France. Millions of people are streaming down from Paris to the south of France, because really the only way to get out was over the Pyrenees to Spain. I opened the book, actually, well, the part of the book that gets into the stories with the rescue of the people who wrote Curious George, which were Sousa Mendes visa recipients, and they were literally on a bicycle with the manuscript in the bicycle, and the Luftwaffe was overhead, shooting people. It was a horrible scene. It was probably the worst traffic jam in history. And people get down to Bordeaux, and they're all over. And it was this moment, actually, the government of France falls. They move to Bordeaux temporarily. De Gaulle is there for a moment. The Vichy guys are there. They're all in Bordeaux, and there's literally millions of refugees camped out everywhere. And everyone's going door to door, including to the United States Embassy, desperate for a visa, because you needed an exit visa, you needed a transit visa, but it was chaos, and everyone slammed the door. And this group of Jews were literally camped out in front of Sousa Mendes' office, and he had a big embassy, a consulate, and he had sent all of his children except for two home, the two oldest. So he had a big empty house, and he went out on the street, and he was very troubled by what he saw. And he met our young rabbi from Antwerp, originally from Poland, who had a big family too, and he started talking to him, and he said, look, you're sleeping on the street, you have all these children, my consulate is empty, come stay for, and stay for the night. So they did, and then he said to him, I want to help you. I'll give you visas. And the rabbi said to him, I can't do that because I can't leave. What about everybody? I can't leave all of my fellow Jews, which was a pretty bold thing to do. I don't think I would have done that, taken the visa. But so he went back out on the street, and Sousa Mendes had this basically nervous breakdown. And he wrote, I've seen the note that he wrote to his brother in Portuguese saying the situation is terrible. I'm having a breakdown. He took to his bed for 2 days, and then he woke up very dramatically, and he said to his family, "We have to basically have to help these people." Came out on the staircase, and he said, "I'm going to give a visa to every single person who wants one, needs one, regardless of religion or who you are." And then he said, it's a great line, he said, "I would rather stand with God against man than with man against God."
And he issues 1,575 visas.
Well, that we know of. And one visa could do more than one person. And among the people he rescued were the Curious George people, Salvador Dali, Paul Rosenberg, who was Picasso and Matisse's dealer, Jean-Michel Franck, the designer, the Rothschilds, the Habsburg family. Hitler hated royalty, and he specifically hated the Habsburgs. He sent paratroopers to try to capture the Empress. The whole family, Sousa Mendes, they got out, the Belgian government got out, and then just hundreds of Jews. And he literally, then this whole kind of cat and mouse thing happens where this woman, British woman, in an act of supreme pettiness, comes to the consulate for a travel visa. And they say to her, there's hundreds of people around, and they said, "Would you mind just waiting?" And she stormed out, and complained to the British embassy that the Portuguese consulate was asking her to wait for her visa, and they reported it back up to Salazar, who went crazy, sent all these very senior guys down. You can drive from
to check it out.
and go find Sousa Mendes, at which point he starts going to other towns where the local guys work for him, some of whom also were very heroic. He starts issuing visas there. At one point, he takes people personally to the border. So this all happens over 3 weeks. It's the single largest rescue in the Holocaust by an individual. They think he may have rescued as many as 30,000 people, but it was definitely at least 10,000. That's many, many times what Oskar Schindler, who did a wonderful thing, did. No one knows who this guy is. And then, as you point out, Margaret, like, what happens to him? So he's
stripped of his position.
Summoned back by Salazar personally, put up on disciplinary hearings, stripped of his position, stripped of his pension.
Loses his property.
Loses his property, loses his law license, goes through his entire life savings. The wife dies, all the children have to leave Europe.
Dies penniless.
He dies penniless. What is crazy is that Salazar, at the end of the war, realized that we were going to win. All of a sudden becomes an American ally. And part of the way that they pitch it is when even after the war, is he said, well, we saved all these people, which later in the war was true. But Sousa Mendes for years
prosecuted the guy who saved them.
Ruined his life. And you can see in their archives of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, the file, because, sorry to go on about him, but the disciplinary hearing, when they got up to the final ruling, they said, yeah, he acted a little crazy, he was upset, he should be reprimanded. And then the guy above him, the foreign minister, said, no, he should be fired or demoted. And then Salazar got it, and he said, no, he's fired, he loses his pension, and he personally signed it. And by the way, it was a very long time before he was recognized, and the United States recognized him before. He's now a national hero in Portugal, but he was finally rehabilitated in 1998.
1998. But you write that he never wavered in his belief.
Nope.
That, quote, the true lesson of Christianity is to love one's neighbor. He was a devout Catholic. Another character you write about is Archbishop Damaskinos,
yes,
who is the only head of a European church to formally condemn the Nazis for the final solution.
Yep.
You write extensively about him. There's also Hiram Bingham. There's others. I actually wonder if you can comment about the common themes between the rescuers.
Yeah.
Are they all religious? Are they motivated by other forces? What do you notice in their commonality? Yeah,
so as I said before, there wasn't a lot of systematic analysis done of them the way there was about perpetrators or bystanders, but there were a couple of, there was one psychological study that was done by Freudians who were Holocaust survivors, and their conclusion was actually the most important thing was how you were disciplined as a child, which is not a very satisfying answer, but I get by why.
Led you to be
if
more likely to save the Jews in the Holocaust?
Well, what they found, the only commonality they found was that if you were somebody who had a parent that would fly off the handle and even smack you, and it was irrational, that tended to gravitate to people who liked authoritarianism. But if you were somebody where your parent, if you were punished, it was explained to you what you did wrong, if the punishment met the crime, and no corporal, but those people tended to be more, it's a very specific thing they found. But what I've found, which I think is relevant, is the following. I think first of all, there were, because I get asked this all the time, what were the common themes? And it's really hard I see patterns. So as I said earlier, certain people in certain professions, particularly if you were exposed to other people, or international. So there were a lot of people, that's why diplomats.
The circus people, the diplomats.
Yeah, people who were creative, they tended to be more open. We can talk about community rescue separately, but the single most important thing for sure was a belief in something higher than you. It was often religion, not always, often religion, but it could have been something political, it could have been a code of honor. So that was, those were patterned. But I would say the single most important thing, and they're obviously all tied up together, is though, I would say almost every rescuer, if not every rescuer I looked at, and I looked at many that are not in the book, all had somebody, usually a parent or both parents, but a figure in their childhood that did a couple of things. maybe three things. They generally, obviously, which is the obvious thing, exposed them to other people and told them you shouldn't hate. They often would tell them, if you see something wrong, you need to do something. Irena Sendler, who was this amazing woman that saved 25 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto, risked her life literally every day. Her father had been a doctor who treated Jews, and he died when she was 8 of typhus, which he caught from poor Jews he was treating. And he always said to her, if you see someone drowning, you have to help them. And then on top of that, I think one other thing that is really important is that people and I say this because this is where we can all make a difference with not necessarily like the Holocaust, but just the society we live in. Children who grew up in a loving home, right, where their interests were valued, where they felt secure. This did correlate. Like it wasn't like the reason people did it, but it's always there. And part of that is because you need to be really self-confident to do what these people did. I mean, you're in an environment where no one else is doing this. You're going against the grain. The common belief is anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, anti-gay, whatever it is, everyone that was persecuted. And you need to have a lot of self-confidence and self-belief that what you're doing is right and that you can make a difference. So I think those are a lot of the, and then you have communities where there was rescue, which goes
I want to talk about that, because so you talk about sort of these 10 examples of extraordinary rescues that are little known. But you also have written about groups of people, in some cases a country, or two countries. There's a case of Denmark, there's a case of Albania, there's a case of this Greek island, where groups of people have stood up against the flow of history, or the trajectory of history. King Christian X of Denmark, the example of the Jews in Albania, which is extraordinary. I didn't even know that the Jewish population of Albania was larger at the end of the war than the beginning. So can you talk about what characteristics, what happened in those communities that caused those countries to stand athwart history yelling stop?
Yeah. I think that's like a really important question for today, to learn that lesson to the extent that there is a lesson to learn. And there is. I mean, they're all different, right? I mean, Albania was majority Muslim, but it was a place where all three religions lived since the Roman Empire. And the American ambassador there, who was Jewish, actually cabled back to America when he got there, and he said, "This is the only place I've ever seen where there's absolutely no religious bigotry." Denmark had outlawed religious discrimination hundreds of years earlier. But they're all different, right? I mean, the Greek island was Orthodox. There's the town of Le Chambon in France, where they were Protestant and where they had a long history of being persecuted themselves because it's a Catholic country. They were Huguenots. They were descendants of Huguenots. The thing that really stuck to me was, like, you take Denmark, because they have this exhibit here, and I think it's important. Like, it's for children, and there's a reason for that. So first of all, 99% of the Danish Jews survived, and I told the story about this guy who was a member of the Nazi Party but not anti-Semitic, who ended up tipping off the Danes, and that's a really interesting story. But there's this famous story about the king of Denmark wearing the Jewish star, and it's not true.
Which is apocryphal.
It's apocryphal because the Danes would not allow the Jews in Denmark to be forced to wear the star. So, certain things are like, there's places where things happened, and in Denmark, it happened to be that the Nazis wanted it to be a model protectorate, and they invaded, and they actually kept the government in place. But what was amazing is that throughout the war, the fascist Nazi party in Denmark consistently polled less than 1%. And the king, when the Germans occupied, said, and the government said, one thing you're not doing is you're not going to touch the Jews. And we're not doing it, and they took a sign from the first day.
So in that case, it was a case of leadership.
Well, no, but yes, but it was the whole country. So leadership was really important, absolutely, both the government and the king. But the Jews there had lived, I mean, many of them had been there, they called them the Viking Jews. A lot of them had come from Spain in 1492. And again, they were their neighbors, and they were their friends. And what the country just, culturally decided, we're not going to turn in our neighbors. And then what happened was, and interestingly, the German army and particularly the Navy, but actually the army, they didn't want to round up the Jews because they knew that the Danes would go crazy, and this would be like which was important because they realized these people will cause a problem for us if they won't go along with it. And even the SS that was there advised against it because they knew the Danes would rise up. And
so why were the Danes more tolerant?
It's a good question. I mean, the Scandinavian countries in general were more tolerant. They have a long history of and they did, but again, I mean, why were the Albanians? Albania has a tradition called Besa, and they in addition to not being bigoted, it's a tradition of hospitality, and if you turn someone over out of your house or out of the country, they'd rather die, literally. There were two brothers that said, Muslim brothers, and they said their parents told them, something like a knock on the door is a gift from God because it's an opportunity to do this, but they would sooner die than turn over a guest of any kind, and that was an ethos there. But the Danes, when finally it goes up to Hitler, and he personally gives the order for the deportation, and then the Danes get tipped off by this guy, and the entire country basically goes into rescue mode. The rabbi, the Nazis always liked to do this on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because they knew everybody would be home. So the Jews got tipped off by the Danes, and the rabbi said to everybody, "We're canceling services tomorrow. It was the day before Rosh Hashanah. Everybody go into hiding." And then what you had was this incredible situation where basically the whole country hid the Jews, and then smuggled them out. I mean, everybody from taxi drivers to medical students to there was literally almost everybody.
Like Dunkirk.
And then they had this amateur flotilla. I tell the story of a rower who had been in the Olympics for Denmark who literally rowed people across to Sweden. Yeah. And you had the entire Jewish population and the spouses of the Jews who were also at risk. Almost all of them get to Sweden. And then 500 get captured because actually some of them got captured because one girl was in love with a Nazi and told him they were hiding. And then there were some Jewish refugees on their way to Palestine that just didn't know where to go. And then there were elderly people in nursing homes. Mm-hmm. So they get captured. They get sent to Theresienstadt, which was like the model camp. It wasn't, but there was a lot of disease there, but you often would go there and then they'd send you east to one of the death camps. And that's where they did the famous, the Red Cross came and inspected and it was a fake Potemkin village. The Danish government all of the time called, protested to the Germans and also checked, and they would call and say, where are the Danish Jews? How are they doing? And they were allowed to send them food and medicine, and they checked on them constantly. And at the end of the war, eventually buses came and picked up the Jews, the Danish Jews, drove them to Sweden, and then they came back. And then there's these amazing stories that were told, which kind of gets to why did the Danes do this, that everyone came back. And in a lot of places in Europe, people took advantage. They took people's apartments, businesses. They were really happy. I mean, they were very opportunistic, turned people in for small amounts of money. In Denmark, people watched people's homes, they took care of their businesses, they fed their pets, they watered their plants. And they basically welcomed them all back. And so 99% of the so one thing I think that stands out for me when I look at some of these places, like the island of Zakynthos, 100% survival rate. Le Chambon, right where Camus was there, he wrote The Plague there, and hotbed of resistance. Right down the road is Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. Mm-hmm. Almost nobody, they saved 5,000 people, 3,500 children, Jews. like, when you have a community where the majority of the community will stand up together, then you see from these cases, even the Nazis back down. And it could have been because they just, I mean, eventually the Danes did rise up and they had a real problem, and it was, you know, they rebelled against the occupation. And that's why I think, like, believe it or not, like this stuff like the anti-bullying campaign, people make fun of, but like, you can see, like, you know, if you're in a, it's important because if you're like in a, let's say you're in a, like, it starts with young children, this all does. Like, if you say to somebody, you see somebody bullying, and you say something, and by the way, like, more than half of us agree with you, right? You're not like the one person doing it. We're like, you know, this is not who our culture is, our country is, our community, then it becomes the culture of the community.
Yeah.
And it's really hard for even, you know, people like the virus of that, or even when you come to, like, it's so alien. So these weren't places necessarily where, like, you know, I mean, the Warsaw Ghetto, the Jews fought back, but in these places, there were like the Le Chambon, the pastor of Le Chambon was known, and the reason he ended up there was he couldn't get a job anywhere else. It was in the middle of nowhere because he was a pacifist. And he was very famous in that. He was like, knew Gandhi and he knew Martin Luther King later. And he believed in nonviolence. I mean, he risked his life many times, and he wasn't against, he actually believed in the war, but he didn't believe in violence. And yet they were able to save almost everybody who came there. And by the way, it was a complete open secret.
Yeah.
Like, the Germans knew they were there.
Yeah, but the Germans also knew they couldn't control them. I want to flag that we're going to go to questions for the audience in one moment, but I'm going to ask Richard. I'm going to take a point of privilege from the moderator,
yes,
or from the questioner. You name-check Herbert Hoover in your introduction.
I did.
And you raise him in the context of the very few political leaders in the world who denounced the persecution of the Jews and stood up for the Jews. We said Winston Churchill, Herbert Hoover, Thomas Dewey, but not that many others.
No.
So enlighten this crowd, this New York crowd,
Yes.
which, you know, may not know this aspect of Herbert Hoover,
yes,
on why Herbert Hoover is important to the Jews.
Yes.
And then your questions, and you don't have to go on and on, but
I'm going to go on about Herbert Hoover for a minute with
bit.
everyone's indulgence, because I actually think, you know, I actually just generally don't like people that are treated unfairly by history. And I think ultimately things, you know, shake out.
Herbert Hoover
time.
was not treated fairly by history, you say?
So,
the mainstream historical narrative
I
maybe
don't
hasn't
think,
quite gotten
no,
him
I think,
right.
so what
Yeah.
you know, we
that's
know of
fair.
Herbert Hoover, what basically people know about Herbert Hoover is the Depression. And, you know, he was president at the time, and they called them Hoovervilles, and we can, you know.
We all know that part.
Yeah, and
What's the part we don't know?
So this is the part you don't, so but maybe people do know in this audience, but so Herbert Hoover was one of the great humanitarians of the first half of the 20th century. And he was actually, you know, he was an amazing person. I learned was a Quaker, which I think had a lot to do with it. Quakers were all over the internment camps in France. American Quakers were the people rescuing. But you know what he was famous for, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Margaret. Before he was president, you know, during World War I, he basically ran the food relief program during and after the war and saved literally millions of people's lives. And he was an amazing guy. He was self-made. He was a mining engineer and a business person, and he was a great organizer. And he went and did this, and he saved a lot of Jews. They weren't singled out. But one thing I will note is that the Jewish community in Europe for this referred to him as like the Moses of the 20th century, before any of the Holocaust. This is like World War I time. And then he, like Churchill, was actually a pretty early Zionist. So when he was president, it was the 15th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, and he issued a notice to the Jewish community basically saying something like, wow, you know, it's amazing what's going on in Palestine. There was nobody there before, and you're building this place. And he was very supportive of it being the eventual homeland. So that happens. But then the Nazis come to power, and they actually, you know, came to power right when he was like leaving office. And so I think then they used to come in March. So Hoover was still president in early 1933, and he gave instructions. So first of all, they were asked at that time that he put out a joint statement denouncing the persecution of the Jews, which was just starting in Germany. And they asked him and FDR, who was the president-elect, to put out a statement. And Hoover said, of course we will, and FDR declined to do so. And then Hoover gave instructions to his ambassador in Germany, in Berlin, to protest to the German government, the treatment of the Jews by the Nazis. And a month or so later, the administration turned over, the new ambassador went there, William Dodd, a well-known figure, and FDR told him, stay out of it, don't say anything. So he overturned the instructions from Hoover. Then later, things start getting really bad. People knew what was going on. So when Kristallnacht happened, I believe Hoover denounced that and made a comment about it. He had met with Hitler and Goering because he was in Germany, and he was a living former president, and he was asked to meet with him. He didn't want to, but he did, and he said, I want to bring along a reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle, I think, and the Nazis stopped the reporter at the door. And there's a lot of arcane stuff, what happened, what did he really say?
But Hitler got very animated, and Hoover ended up leaving and tried to write a report back to the FDR State Department, and they didn't want to debrief with him.
And he apparently had an argument with Hoover. He was trying to keep it calm because Hitler was known for flying off the handle, and he was trying to explain to him, like, this stuff you're doing here, not about the Jews, but just about the authoritarian. He's like, that doesn't work. We can't. That's not how the U.S. works.
It's not going to go over.
And he started to talk about democracy, so the New York Times reported that they had this big fight. But more importantly, so he had his own interaction with kind of over his objection.
It was 1938.
Yeah. So 39. There was a bill in Congress, the Wagner-Rogers Act, to bring 20,000 Jewish children to the United States, and Hoover, behind the scenes, because he was still a very prominent politician, lobbied really hard for that to get passed. They say, there's a line, it would have saved Anne Frank's life, which probably maybe she would have been one of them, and that was not in anyone's political interest at that time, and he, I think, wanted to be president again, and but he did that. He really went out on a limb, and so he was doing that, on his own. And then, really amazingly, in 1943, because people always say, and I think there's this misperception that we didn't know what was going on, and people knew a lot of what was going on. I write about in the book Varian Fry, who was similar to Sousa Mendes, saved all the artists and writers, gets expelled, comes back, writes an article in the New Republic saying, there's millions of Jews being killed. And so there was a pageant. There was a guy that many of you may be familiar with named Peter. He went by the name of Peter Bergson. His real name was Hillel Cook, but he was Israeli, and he came here, or Palestinian, and he was arguing very loudly we have to do something to save the Jews. He was taking out full-page ads in the New York Times. They were opportunities to buy ransom Jews. And one of the projects he had was to have a conference to address the issue, and then they did this pageant, which was written by Ben Hecht, the screenwriter. And it had a lot of Jews in it, but it also had, by the way, Frank Sinatra and Burgess Meredith and Ralph Bellamy. And one of the sponsors of it, was Herbert Hoover, because he was a former president. And it sold out, 1943, Madison Square Garden, Hollywood Bowl, Philadelphia, and Hoover was completely, and they said in this thing, 2 million civilian Jews have died in Europe. This is while the State Department is saying nothing. I have a whole other story because my cousin worked for the Treasury Department, and it wasn't until the very end of the war that we even tried to do anything, and it was only by accident. Okay. But if I can just finish one thing. So Hoover in 43 also gave an address on CBS radio at this conference, basically saying his plan for saving the Jews, and he wanted to set up places in neutral countries, and then he said we need to there process them into places like the United States, and they should be coming. And then he believed that the Jews should end up in Palestine, but he also had a plan to bring them to parts of Africa where nobody lived, and he laid out this whole plan on CBS radio. And then in 1944, the Republican Party, this was the first time ever, at his behest, had a plank first of either parties to call for a homeland for the Jews of Europe, basically in Palestine. And so he was amazing, and he was very outspoken when nobody else was. And so I think it's, what do we know? Like the fact that the thing that people know him, like, is all in the family. And he's, they're singing about him, this guy who's like the archetypal bigot. And
he's
this
the
guy
opposite.
is the greatest, of every president for many, he was like, you think about people like, Lincoln or whatever in terms of like, trying to do good for the world. He did that before he was president. Yeah. And so I think like it's very unknown. And the thing is, like, in the Jewish community in general, and I think you saw it in some, because I know people cannot come to grips with the fact that FDR could have done more. And I've read the transcripts. Like, I've seen plans. I wrote about a plan.
You called FDR anti-Semitic.
For sure, he was anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
That's he also could have been anti-Semitic and done stuff. People there were people who there are people in my book who there was a woman in Poland who founded an organization called Zegota, and there were two women that founded it. One was the wife of the former ambassador to Washington, D.C., who was a liberal Democrat. Her partner in the organization, which saved many, many Jews, was a right-wing, ethno-nationalist, anti-Semite. But she did not think Jews should be killed. And she founded this organization and publicly came out and said, we should not murder the Jews of Poland, and ended up risking her life to save thousands. So you can be an anti-Semite and still not think people should be killed.
So FDR should have done more.
You should be. I'm just going to say. So I think it was mentioned earlier. Margaret Herbert Hoover is her great grandfather, but I was interested in Herbert Hoover before we knew each other, and this story, and it was in my book already because he was, again, it was so unusual for anybody to speak out, and again, I think it's like it's a part of his life and his legacy that's more important than anything else he did, and he did many, this humanitarian side of him, and that's what we should know about him.
Or it should be seen in the fullness of anyone's legacy, I think.
Well, but to me, like, I don't know, like the Great Depression, because, there are many people, you can argue about what the New Deal and all, and like they didn't know what to, that was a national crisis.
We knew nothing about modern macroeconomics at the time. We learned everything about it.
Taking your time to say, volunteering and saving several million people during World War I who were dying of famine, that's what that was done, that was, a volunteer work, right?
As a private citizen.
So anyway.
Thank you.
I hope we changed your, I just think,
we hope you have had an open mind to Herbert Hoover.
So I think you should be very, very proud of your ancestor.
I am, and I'm very devoted to
we should all, as Americans,
legacy. Yeah. Thank you. All right, let's see. Let's see how many we can squeeze in quickly. I might have a timer for your answers, so we can get as many of people. Okay, perfect. Right here, since the microphone's here, and please wait for the microphone so that the people who are on the live stream can hear your question.
Hi. The book is incredible, spectacular. Everyone should read it. I'm only up to, I just finished chapter 3, Gino Bartali. But already I could say, to Margaret's point, every chapter could be its own movie. But I
think he's my favorite, actually, but yeah.
Yeah. My question is, there must have been a much wider list as you gathered the people that you're going to write about. And I know we're pressed for time, but could you pick one that just didn't make the cut into the book and tell us about what they did that didn't make it into the book?
I'll give you one that's sort of been top of my mind recently. So there were many, and my book was originally going to be 15 chapters, but it would have been multi-volumes. But so I actually just wrote an article about this guy because it was his birthday, Roddy Edmonds, who was an American. He's the 5th American to be honored at Yad Vashem. And I have a little pet project that we should all do, which is, he's not been honored by our country, but the story is basically as follows. I just did something for Time magazine on it. So he was from Tennessee. He enlisted in World War II, and he was at the Battle of the Bulge. There was the American part of the army was surrounded, and his commanding officer surrendered. So he was captured. This was like in 1944, and the Nazis sent them to camp, like labor camps, and they were separating out Jewish American soldiers, and sending them east. And many of them died. It's like an unknown story that they were like going after the Jewish POWs. And so after a few months, they sent him, for some reason the Nazis divided out the officers, the non-commissioned officers, and the enlisted men. He was an NCO. They get sent, all of them together. He's the highest-ranking NCO. There were 1,400 people. And they go to this camp where there were the Russians and British POWs. And the first night, they get there, and the German commandant comes over the loudspeaker and says, all Jews will report tomorrow morning in front of the barracks, because they were going to pull them out and, probably kill, send them east, and they'd disappear. And Edmonds, who I don't know if he ever met a Jew before, because he did in the army, but he was from, like a very small town. He said, we're all going out. So the next morning, they all lined up. He's at the front, 1,400 people. The Nazi comes running over and he says, these cannot all be Jews. And he said to him, we're all Jews here. There were 200 Jews out of the 1,400. So the guy pulls out his Luger, points it at his head, okay, and says, if you don't tell me who the Jews are, I'm going to shoot you. And he said, this guy was a kid, 24 years old. He said, if you shoot me, you better shoot all of us, because we all know who you are, and the troops are coming, the war is over, and you're going to be hanged for war crimes. The guy turns red, puts the Luger away, and storms off. And not to keep going the story, he actually ended up getting our soldiers liberated earlier. So he comes back, doesn't tell anybody he did this, re-enlists in Korea, dies in like 1985. No one knows he did this. His granddaughter is doing a project for school, and her father, who's a pastor, is helping her. And they come across an article in the New York Times where one of the Jews he saved, some of them became famous, was interviewed what happened in the war, and he said, well, there was this guy, Roddy Edmonds, was my officer, and he stood up to this Nazi and saved all of us. And the son didn't know, and they went around and started find out who the people were that were there, because there were a lot of eyewitnesses. They learned the story, and it became public. And he then, a few years ago, when Obama was president, because he spoke at it, he was the 5th person, American, to be honored at Yad Vashem, and the only one for saving American Jews. And the reason I wrote the article is that there's legislation in Congress to honor him, and it keeps failing because they can't get enough people to show up to vote. And then the Army will not give him the Medal of Honor because they say that he didn't do this in combat, even though a German pointed a gun at his head. So if anybody wants to correct the historical record, tell your congressman to show up on whatever day they're voting, and if you know anybody in the Army, it's time for him, honestly, to get the medal, so that's I think that's really interesting. And he's American.
It's a great example. Let's go right over here. And I think we can probably do one more after this. I'm sorry, we're tight on time.
I find it, when I listen to you, and I've heard you speak before, I find it incredible when I think about that era. In our world today, which is much more multicultural, and we have a lot more awareness about people of different colors and different cultures and all, people back in the 30s didn't travel, so they didn't experience other people. And I can just imagine how strange the Jews must have seemed, because the Jews of those days, although you had secular Jews in Germany and all, were really a lot more devout, so they looked Jewish. And it's amazing how, just trying to understand how all these people could, of course, see the Jews as the other, just as they would see blacks or they would see Romani as other. And it's just amazing how people were able to cross the line and not see them that way, or connect with them beyond that vast difference. Obviously, circumcision made it men very different and easily identifiable. Did you ever get into talking to any of the people that you talked to, talking about how they were able to make that leap from seeing these people as other and becoming people that they could accept?
Well, some people that was a choice. For some people, they didn't really think about the other. They had been grown up. Some of them had grew up on Jews, but some who didn't. There's definitely a personality type that did this. There were also places, it's interesting, the Greek Jews were quite interesting because the Greek Jews in the north were very different. They were actually very different. They were Sephardic. So when the Nazis showed up, they were like, wait, what is this? These don't look like the Jews that we know from Eastern Europe. And then the Romanot Jews in the south, which I didn't know existed until I wrote the book, were completely, they looked Greek, they acted Greek, they had Greek names, they'd fought for Greece, they died for Greece. They'd been there since Alexander the Great. They didn't look different, they weren't different. People knew they were Jewish, but they were they're Greeks first, they're Jews second. You know, religion wasn't important to them. But yeah, these people, there was something in a lot of these people that were able to see somebody who was other and a humanity to feel compassion or empathy for them. There was also an element, I think, of people who saw people like the woman I said her father told her, when you see someone drowning, these people were drowning. And there's some people who see that and they're like, I have to help them. They're not even stopping to think who I'm and there were plenty of rescue. Like I think, honestly, when you talk about the Yad Vashem criterion, I think there were many more rescue. Like I think you take 27,000, it's still tiny, but multiplied by 100, because Primo Levi wrote when he was imprisoned and still in Italy, there was a man named Lorenzo who brought him soup. It's a very famous quote, and he said that man kept me alive because I knew somebody actually cared about me and still thought of me as a person. So, you know, letting somebody stay the night. You know, even they talked about, you know, in Holland, there was a rescuer, and he said, well, you know, people like us were the tip of the spear. But what made it work in Holland, where there was a higher, I mean, it wasn't great, but there was a higher rescue, was that everyone around us sympathized. So we risked our lives, but what allowed us to do it was the person looking the other way as opposed to turning us in. So
that's a great point.
I think you know, people, I mean, for sure the rescuer, like they viewed like this, they had this view of humanity first, and then, you know, and like the people, like I think the parable of the Good Samaritan saved more Jews in Europe than anything else. This concept of, you know, helping somebody, you know, the people would often refer to like, you know, love thy neighbor as thyself. The people who were religious, like that, the people who really internalized that. Like when you look at religion, by the way, like the people who were into religion for hierarchical purposes or because they wanted to show off how pious they whatever, they were not that. But the people that really really believed and had faith and also believed in these teachings, that's where you had people who really, you had an outsized number of rescuers who were religious, but it was the people who really felt, you know, we're a community, like I need to help a fellow person in distress.
All right. I think we're going to wrap it there. Here's what I want to remind everyone, is that the book is for sale, and Richard will be signing books just out front here. So please feel free to grab one on your way out, and if you have additional questions, Richard can answer them. The book is In the Garden of the Righteous. Richard Hurowitz, thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank everybody. Thank you all for coming and for listening. Thank you.